Welcome back. Last day of Arctic Frontiers 2024. Actions and reactions, global actions and Arctic regions, Arctic reactions. Also last day of the RecapTV. We have heard 90 minutes of Arctic security and local resilience, and now we're here to discuss on what has been discussed and what we think has not been discussed and should be discussed in the future. So thank you for my three participants for this RecapTV. To my right, Gabrielle Gundry, emerging leader from Arctic Frontiers Emerging Leader Program, but also a national security analyst at Los Alamos National Lab. That was good, no?
Yeah.
Good. To her right, Whitney Lackenbauer, professor at Trent University in Canada, and to his right, senior Arctic official for Finland, Petteri Vuorimäki. Welcome, all of you. I hope you enjoyed the session. I did. It was very practical, but also very philosophical to some extent. Let's start with some very broad question. We talked about Arctic security, broadly debated geopolitical debates all over the world, basically, and how local resilience can be strengthened in this kind of new era. We talked a lot about this new era yesterday, new narratives about the Arctic. The Cold War has brought peace to it, and now there's a new era. What will be the new narrative? Petteri, let's start with you. Obviously, we'll not talk about the Arctic Council, but let's talk about, or maybe let's talk about the local resilience perspective from an Arctic Council perspective, and your thoughts on how can you strengthen local resilience all over the Arctic in this new era that we are facing currently.
Thanks very much. I mean, let me just first say I thought it was a really possibly the best panel of Arctic Frontiers 2024. It was really thought-provoking, and it helped all of us to understand that when we talk of security, it is not only a question of military security. My good friend Ed Alexander from Critical Council also referred to the animal security, and security pertains to environment and climate, and for that we all need resilient. We need to be resilient on an individual basis. The communities need to be resilient, and that requires cooperation, preparation. We need knowledge. Predictions are always difficult, particularly those pertaining to the future. But the point is that we need to be prepared for all possible eventualities. And I think, as my colleague Janne Kuusela said, Finland is resilient. We have been prepared for decades. And I think as an Arctic nation, we contribute to security, and we are resilient and prepared, come what may.
Whitney, as a follow-up, from a more academic perspective, but you also have apparently this practical background as a Canadian ranger, how would you see the current situation of like enhancing local resilience?
Well, I think building on that, Andreas, it was a rich conversation, and I echo Petteri on this, in terms of the diversity of perspectives and thinking about scales. So often when we're talking about the geopolitical dangers that we're facing collectively as a planet right now and how those relate to a region, we're often thinking at a state level. And it's appropriate, and we heard voices speaking from various state perspectives on the need for working together and building towards comprehensive security, as well as total defense concepts. We also, I think, heard perspectives very much grounded in homelands. So those of Indigenous rights holders from all across the circumpolar Arctic, and thinking about how any actions that we're taking are very mindful of the implications, or in your language, the reactions or actions that's implications for people who are very much grounded in homelands. And that there is always the possibility that can lead to tension and perhaps destabilize the relationships that hold us together as countries and countries that are reflective of the needs and attentive to the needs of local peoples and rights holders. But that we also see great opportunity space. That we look at this, I think, coming out of this panel, it's not as an either-or equation between whether we're dealing with global geopolitical pressures or local things. We actually have to deal with both simultaneously and make sure that we're very much listening at all times to the diversity of stakeholders and rights holders involved in this space.
Can I have
Definitely, yeah.
two elements? Whitney sparked me on this. In terms of resilience and preparedness, I think there are two important concepts that were referred to in the panel today. One is trust. Mm-hmm. My colleague from the Ministry of Defense made the point that the Nordic countries have an exceptional level of trust between each other. I think that trust can be extended also to our North American allies, certainly. And in a certain sense, there was something that really touched me, which I was not aware of. And the other key concept is caring. When a representative from the city of Oulu said that during the COVID pandemic, during 1 week, they managed to launch a campaign with the NGOs during which they called every single household that had over 65 aged individuals, only to ask, how are you doing? And it's this notion of caring and trust that will take us a long way in terms of resilience and preparedness and being able to sustain ourselves.
That was a very strong message. I fully agree. Following up with Gabrielle, trust, caring, listening. We heard a lot about that over the last 2 days as well. How did you... Are people listening to the emerging leaders as well, as they're supposed to listen to all stakeholders in the Arctic? Have you discussed that? More the general perspective of listening to a younger generation, but also, of course, in that security, local resilience setup?
So I think when it comes to resilience, I think there is a lot of knowledge that has been established by the previous generations that people are really wanting to stay set in. And I like what you said about the new narrative, and I'd kind of like to talk about that a bit because it was also discussed during the panel that it's not necessarily a new narrative that we're seeking, but rather going back to old narratives that have been existing for thousands, tens of thousands of years. And it's not about finding new solutions, but maybe about going back and connecting to our roots, the old solutions that have been working and underpinning our environmental stability and therefore security for a very, very long time. In terms of listening to those people, I think there is a lot of work to be done, whether that be indigenous peoples, whether that be younger voices. I think there is it's been a very big difficulty for young people to break their voice into this realm and be taken seriously. And I've had a great experience at this conference, but to be honest, I think we still all experience that. And we're considered early career until we're about 35 years old. And, we are people who I don't personally have a PhD, but a lot of the emerging leaders do have a PhD. And there's also the question of maybe somebody with a traditional knowledge base doesn't have a PhD, but still has extremely relevant information. And so what kinds of requirements are we using to base and assess the measurement of knowledge these days? Does that need to be redefined? So it's about not necessarily a new narrative, but keeping to and connecting to the old ones while redefining our current terms of what knowledge we should be using, and in terms of security, what even is security today.
It's a fantastic...
May I, Gabby, build on that? Because I think you're touching on a number of really key themes that jumped out at me from the panel as well. Thinking about what questions we should be asking. So learning to listen, to ask questions and invite different diverse subject knowledge holders or subject matter experts to contribute. So we heard from, for example, the Sami Parliament President speak to perhaps not from a Sami positionality saying what the conventional defense requirements are, but once there is an identified need for certain types of activities or say building a new base, that Sami, as people rooted in a homeland who are attuned to that environment, physical environment and human environment, that they're invited to contribute in a substantive way to bring their knowledge and help for certain decisions around when certain activities might take place within a year, where certain things may be undertaken to minimize negative disruptions, say on the reindeer. So when I look at that, it's really opening our aperture a bit and thinking about not just going to single groups of experts and thinking that we're satisfied. Often those exist within our institutional silos or our comfortable circles, but broadening it out and realizing we're actually stronger together. Our advantage in the West, in our democratic open societies, is by being able to bring diverse groups of people together and actually learn from one another. And I think we're all stronger at the end.
But on the
Gabby
practical
said.
level, how do you do that? How do you, not destroy, but how do you open this silo of knowledge in a way,
I think, if you don't mind if I add on to this, I was particularly touched by the Gwich'in representative who brought a very direct and emotionally raw perspective. I think as a society, we are, and especially in the security society, we are taught to really suppress emotion. You know, we're all about the facts, the analytics. But these facts are incredibly emotional. I think we have to be more attuned to listening to our emotional side of this. I think I was very, very touched by his argument, and we need to listen to these new tones within this field.
Just on the issue of younger generation, I'm certainly not representative of the younger generation as is visible, but I mean, I'm a proud father of two representatives of the youngest generation. I've talked to many young people across the circumpolar Arctic, and that has made me understand that what the young people are really concerned about, afraid of, is climate change and its impact on the world and for their future. And I have said openly, and as a member of my generation, our generation, I feel ashamed of what we have done. I feel ashamed of the kind of world that we have left behind for our sons and daughters. And we need to do everything that we possibly can to rectify the situation. If I heard him right, I think it was a Swedish commander who made the point that the climate change is the biggest threat in the Arctic. And it was an excellent point. Again, Ed Alexander Concreting Council, he's a master of making excellent points. But one of the excellent points that he made today was sort of reversing the sustainability issue. And he was saying that the Arctic region had underpinned the global security for millennia, and he was referring to the parts of North American Arctic and Russian Arctic sitting on top of a thawing permafrost. And not many people understand the immense risk that entails in terms of carbon emissions, but also the pathogens which are buried in the permafrost. Now, if that permafrost continues to thaw, infrastructures will collapse, there'll be a huge amount of carbon emissions, and there will be dangerous airborne pathogens that will result in pandemics in the years to come that we can't even imagine.
Gabrielle?
I really respect your opinion on this, and I'd just like to say I'm really appalled by how much of an alarmist society we are, that we need a wake-up call to be able to act. So our security infrastructure is based on a series of wake-up calls, and it was brought up that February 22 was a wake-up call, but I'm thinking all the way back to World War II. I mean, my laboratory, Los Alamos, was incepted out of a necessity to create an atomic bomb to end the war. That was one wake-up call. But technically, we should have had a system in place to assess these threats before we even had to go so far as to go to those measures. And now climate change is at such a advanced level that we are being reactionary instead of proactive. And if we don't have an environment to protect us, to nurture us, and we're cutting off our life source, there are no people to protect anymore. That is the very value of security that defines us. And I think it's very contradictory.
Well spoken.
Yeah, very well spoken. I think coming out of this as well, Commander Lundqvist, Stefan Lundqvist from Swedish Defence University, used this framework of threats through to and in the Arctic, and also about different sectors of security, so sort of the classic military, political, economic, environmental, societal. And I think it's bringing those together. And as you're speaking to, Gabby, right now we're at a moment, especially over the last couple of years, where I think we have a lot of emphasis on the military security. And a lot of emphasis on the political. And I think our challenge right now is to making sure that we're attentive to all of the sectors of security. And if we are looking at perhaps the most existential, yes, nuclear weapons and avoiding a nuclear holocaust is absolutely key. But at the same time, the looming one for our ability to, as a species, literally to be able to exist on this planet that nurtures and sustains us, is coming to terms with these grand environmental challenges. So I think, we can look at NATO, for example, and it building into various communiques. We are competing with some countries, militarily and politically, we might say, but we have to work together if we're going to address global climate change, because this is not something that the 7 like-minded Arctic states, in partnership with, say, indigenous peoples, can solve on our own.
But can I ask a provocative question here? I mean,
I like provocative questions.
We all know that this is a complex security picture. But if you are in, somewhere in continental Europe, somewhere maybe in Southern Asia, wherever, South America, and you read about the Arctic, you often read about geopolitics, those security matters. And that's Arctic shipping, the stories that sell, and less about the more local security, food security questions that are so important for the Arctic, but of course also in big thing. So what could be your role as a policymaker, your role as a scientist, as a researcher, your role as an emerging scientist, researcher, to change that picture a bit or two?
Well, I mean, for my humble part, as I roam around the circumpolar Arctic and elsewhere, in my interventions and speeches, I have attempted to underline the need to maintain the overall perspective on the circumpolar Arctic, that people have to understand that it's not only a matter of one issue, be it the military security or be it economic prospects or be it climate change or be it this or that, but it's a question of very delicate balances that will need to be found on several difficult issues, and one has to be able to see the whole picture. The second point, I think it's a point that I've made in every single presentation or intervention that I've made over the years that I've held my position, is that I've highlighted the vulnerable position of the indigenous people in the circumpolar Arctic. I have had countless hours of fascinating discussions with Quechins, Inuits, Sami people, Atapashkans, Aleuts, and others. And I don't claim that I understand their difficulties and challenges, but I have some understanding, because these people are at the front line of climate change. They are at the core of the exponentially rising international interest towards the Arctic. And they're fighting hard to maintain their culture, their livelihood, their traditions, and their language. And they need and they require and they deserve the support of the states where they live. But they are in a very challenging situation.
Thank you very much, Peter.
And I think in the spirit of what you're saying about agreeing very much with everything you've said, I think the downside to the vulnerability narrative, which is very real, is that it can sometimes lead us to overlook the strengths that are very much reflected in the voices that we heard, from the North and of the North. So also looking at some of the models we might have to inspire success in empowered engagement with communities. So we heard Jackie Jacobson from Tuktoyaktuk in Canada's Northwest Territory speak about his role with the Canadian Rangers, a very unorthodox military unit that's actually based upon individuals having Indigenous knowledge or locally based knowledge that they're bringing to a different form of service, not so they're trained to go overseas and fight wars, but to actually serve at home, serve their communities and their country simultaneously. I look at that because that's a 75-year-old organization. So as Gabby was saying before, I think it's interesting because in some cases we're looking for new ways of addressing vulnerabilities. In the other case, there's a ton of embodied wisdom and grounding wisdom, this ancient knowledge, as Ed Alexander was mentioning, that we're also turning to. So when I think about resilience, which is usually the phrase that I've used when describing North American Indigenous peoples in the history classes I teach, they're adaptable, resilient societies. How does that continue to animate us in the present? So the answers to vulnerability is not for us from the outside to engineer Western scientific solutions. We can contribute some of that. That's going to be part of the picture, but it's also really respecting and embracing some of these deeper, time-built ways of knowing and being and seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the evolving relationship between balancing. You mentioned a balancing act, and I thought that was very accurate, between environmental and defense interests. And it's interesting because at the same time, they are two very different things, but also one and the same. And so when it comes to balancing that, how do you balance two seemingly contradictory yet similar things? And what I mean by that is with the February 22 Russian invasion of Ukraine, scientific cooperation was halted. But at the same time, we need that science, which has either there's been delayed access or no access to that science, specifically with permafrost gaps around the region. And that science can be used to inform security. And my job is to use science to inform security decisions. But at the same time, you don't want science to become strictly a security measure. Science also transcends a lot of knowledge boundaries, a lot of cultural boundaries. Science is just science, and it's become very political. But then when you need it to be involved and want it to be to become involved in security, then it becomes more polarizing. So how do you maintain that balance and be able to use it, keep its integrity while using it for the purposes of security is my question.
And that's not only an Arctic issue.
No, I think it's very applicable to a lot, but we've been able to see it because it's been put on the global stage because of the Ukraine crisis.
We are on the issue of security, and in a certain sense I feel obliged to also make the point that, of course, military security is part of security, and we certainly need to enhance our resilience, deterrence, preparedness, and capabilities. Finland's and Sweden's accession to the alliance will certainly contribute to that. In Finland, the notion of military security is sort of it's sort of inborn. It's self-evident. Huge majority of the Finns are prepared to defend Finland, even if the outcome was uncertain. And just to, try to explain that on a personal level, my late father, he took part in the two wars. He got wounded once. I spent 1 year in the military, followed by a second year as a second lieutenant. My son, who's 20, spent 1 year in the military, and if I remember correctly, he's been called in for refresher training twice already. So it's present in Finland. It has always been present in Finland. When one of our former presidents, Mauno Koivisto, did a fantastic book on Russia's idea, which has been translated to tens of languages. He was interviewed in the radio station in Moscow, and the interviewer said, "Well, Mr. President, thanks for the book. What is then Finland's idea?" And his instantaneous reply was survival. And that's been at the core of our self-consciousness, that we are geostrategically and geographically in a very challenging location. And for decades and centuries, we've tried to survive, and we have. And I think we've done reasonably well.
From Finland, because one point raised in the panel was preparedness, obviously, emergency preparedness, different definitions of preparedness, and that this does not happen overnight. So if we zoom out from the Finnish situation to a circumpolar Arctic situation, what is needed that cannot happen overnight, but is like a bit more a medium and long-term discussion to be better prepared to whatever kind of security we need to be prepared.
I'm happy to jump in on this one, Andreas. As an academic, I'm allowed to, I guess, be a little bit idealistic on this. I think some of the conversations are around the potential need for new narratives. And that's been an overarching theme at many of the sessions here over the last few days. And I think we may question whether it's a new narrative, but these ideas of comprehensive security, which is very much a Northern European frame or a European frame that I think aligns with a lot of the conversations going on in North America as well. So it's and you brought up balance repeatedly, Gabby, which is a key theme. It's realizing that survival is actually dependent upon an awareness of how all of these different ideas around security interconnect. There's inherently, from a political decision-making and resourcing standpoint, going to be a hierarchy at given moments of what is the most immediate priority. But I think it is important for us as in our societies to be taking that long-term view and realizing that we have to actually be thinking about security in this broad-based way across many sectors. That's tough if you're trapped in cultures. I know you have an election right around the corner where foreign and defense, issues have been very, very prominent. But certainly within North America, if you feel like you're literally living in a continuous election cycle, to have that long-term vision and to take the time as well to explain the interconnectedness and the complexity, rather than trying to score, the language around quick wins is often used in North America, which I often kind of brace against to say, but that's superficial. I want to see it nested in a broader concept leading towards our survival. And beyond survival, I want us to thrive. That's what gives us inspiration.
Something that you said just now reminded me that we shouldn't be relying only on very ambitious individuals to carry all of these logistical works. To make these breakthroughs. I think that's a really dangerous thing to rely on, and we should instead focus on creating a lot better institutional strength and capacity that fosters transition of knowledge between positions, as opposed to relying on a few ambitious individuals who, when they then take a different position or they retire or they step down from power, all of that work is lost and you have to start from square one. And I think that's happened a lot in this field, where then people, I've gotten the response so many times with these topics of, this got brought up 10 years ago. And Indigenous peoples have also mentioned this of, we're tired of being asked the same questions of what do we need, what do we want? And even in regular other local societies as well, it's the same questions, and they're like, what have you done with it? And there was a lot done in a certain time span, and then when the person that was running that operation leaves, all of that knowledge is not transitioned on in the way that was intended because it wasn't built into the infrastructure. It was relied upon on that person. So I think building better institutional capacity.
I think that's an important topic for another side event, the matter of legacy, not only from an institutional perspective, but also from a knowledge perspective. How can you actually hand over knowledge that we don't always turn in circles?
And with emergency response, you don't have the time to be spending all of these years rebuilding that work. The crises that we've been seeing have been happening with increased frequency and intensity, where you need a lot better emergency responses. And if we have this disjointed effort and this gap in knowledge transition, that makes that a lot more difficult to adapt to. So I think the adaptation of the structure is not up to par.
And really quickly, Gabby, building on that, I think this is also opportunity space. We can learn from each other as allies and partners. Mm-hmm. We must learn from each other. Yes. And again, we heard about the model of the Canadian Rangers. That kind of a model is not going to directly translate into Alaska or into a Finnish. Does it inspire thinking about how we're focusing on not only investing in national level assets, which are going to be key to certain forms of, say, search and rescue response or massive dislocating emergency crisis, humanitarian associated environmental crisis, but that at the same time, we're also investing in communities and realizing how building those thriving, strong communities we heard about from many of the panelists is actually a key to having that resilience, that preparedness in place. And it really is then, again, back to this concept of the balance, right? Yes, it's burden sharing in a positive, healthy way where we all want to see our responsibility played and make sure that that's allocated. And we're learning from each other about how that's done well.
I think colleagues are speaking so well, it's difficult to add anything. But I think what we need is sort of better planning, better situational awareness, better analysis, and we've ended up in such a complex situation that we may need to find new ways of looking at things, trying to identify new solutions. For that, I would call for even tighter interaction between the research community and then the policymakers or as humble civil servants. And I think for the research community, I remember when I started in this post in 2019, I was interviewed by countless students and researchers And I was trying to understand why most of them who were studying the Arctic were doing a paper or a piece or a PhD or what have you on the Arctic security. And then I started thinking that maybe this is because at the end of the day, the issues pertaining to military security in the Arctic are possibly easier to understand than the intricate and complex web of other issues pertaining to the Arctic, be it on the various aspects of climate change or environmental protection or legal, cultural situation of the indigenous peoples, the need for sustainable development, business opportunities, raw materials, and all of that.
Yes.
So I think the research community, as I try to do, should sort of maintain and develop the sort of a comprehensive perspective on the circumpolar Arctic.
There was also a point about more inclusivity of local and indigenous peoples and military operations happening more at the community level, making decisions about that more at the community level as opposed to a blanket policy that is established. For example, in the US, a lot of these decisions are established in DC, which is not quite the South, but is just bordering between it. It's definitely much further south than Alaska. And I mean, of course, there's a lot of collaborative effort, but the headquarters are, in fact, in DC and making decisions for a region that is really far away. And this kind of community level operational capacity is important as well. That was touched upon in the panel.
I love it because I think even calling from what you're suggesting, Gabby, and Petteri, what you're mentioning about, I would use a fancy word of more fidelity, like more clarity. And we heard about characterizing threats or categorizing threats. One of the things I often think about is if we're talking about military threats, be they nuclear or conventional, that will pass through the Arctic, that's perhaps a different set of analysts or decision makers that will need to be around the table than when we're thinking about what the threats are to the Arctic and thinking about them across the different sectors of security.
All very
and then in the
yeah.
Arctic in particular, saying that must, and I will make a normative term, like saying it must start with northern peoples themselves at the forefront of not only observing, but also defining what opportunity spaces are to respond appropriately to challenges within the region. So I think that's the wonderful opportunity space for all of us in our respective roles, is to think about what those, and again, getting to the practical spaces. We have wonderful exchanges on a conceptual level at meetings like this, and those are important. I'm not dismissing those. But at the end of the day, I'm still eager, having been in this space now for a couple of decades, to say, so what are the practical solutions? What are the outcomes of Arctic frontiers in these kind of panels? And how can we build forward together in ways of actually realizing this vision?
And can I mention one more point? Sorry, I have so much to add on this topic. But I think also national security is a collection of community insecurities. And so when you're removing that communal aspect, you're creating a very large problem. And there was also the mention of overlooking basic necessities of life, which I feel is often excluded in the larger security standpoint. So we're looking at a lot of the hard security threats. And for some reason, these basic necessities such as access to water, food, infrastructure are seen as more of a soft threat. And I would argue that these are equally a hard threat, but because they're felt more at the local capacity and not so much on the global scale, even though they are, but when we're discussing it in the Arctic context, we narrow down because it's more easily understandable to us to look at it in case studies.
So conceptually, we need to redefine hard security. We just skips hard and soft. It's also.
Can I make one point before we run out of time? Andreas, you will hate me for this because you started the interview by saying that, of course, we're not going to talk about the Arctic Council, but I don't want to meet
problematic issues.
I don't want to meet my colleagues outside this studio if I hadn't said that the Arctic Council is and shall remain the preeminent format for the cooperation in the circumpolar Arctic. And I think Prime Minister Støre of Norway had a very, very strong message on that in his intervention yesterday, and I'd like to use the opportunity to thank Norway for the excellent work that they're doing. And if any country can do that which is needed, it is Norway. And it also ties into what we're discussing, because the Arctic Council has a key role to play in that comprehensive approach on the Arctic realities across the circumpolar Arctic. That's why it is needed, and that's why it has and will continue to play a major role.
Petteri, may I play on that? Because I think the connection I see to what Gabby just said as well is I think precisely why the Arctic Council remains and will remain the preeminent forum for that dialogue is because it doesn't deal with entirely comprehensive security and that the military sector of security was left out. Certainly Canada, in the lead up to the creation of the Arctic Council, had pushed quite stridently to have that included. I think rightly it was left off to the side because it would have meant that in the situation we find ourselves now, an Arctic Council that had included that could not exist. It can exist still going forward, and I think making sure that we're reinforcing there are opportunity spaces. They're not going to be as easily accessible for collaboration across the truly circumpolar world. We really have to look at when it's going to be appropriate to re-engage in certain types of relationships, as has been done over the last year. But I think also demonstrate some patience in realizing that the Arctic Council, whatever it looks like going forward, remaining that preeminent forum, is, in my view, unlikely to look the way it did in January of 2022. But that doesn't mean that it's irrevocably broken or somehow failing. In fact, I think it's under very good stewardship by Petteri, you and yourself and your colleagues over the last few years to make sure that it does remain intact. And as you say, having these institutions that allow for knowledge to be passed along is absolutely essential.
If we have Whitney on the table, you don't need me as host summarizing. But I think it's really what you guys said. It's like the Arctic Council was a key part of this old narrative, after the Cold War ended in the last 20 years, and now it will be a key part of a potential new narrative. Agreed. Or an old new narrative, whatever you bring it together in a very conceptually political scientist point of view. We are definitely out of time, but on a very stereotypical point, I want to raise one more thing, asking for a very brief definition. I have to do it, Petteri. I'm sorry. Your Finnish representative said Finland would bring know-how to the alliance. Can we define what is know-how? Not in a hard security matter, but maybe in an Arctic light, Arctic frontier science policy, business perspective. What is know-how? Let's start with you.
Harsh conditions, long distances, ability to sustain life and construct infrastructure with proper insulation, caring and trusting, and having confidence on the public authorities doing their work. On the military aspect, Finland doesn't have an Arctic contingent because our defense forces in their entirety are Arctic compatible.
Thanks a lot. Whitney, know-how?
Know-how for me is very simple. Those of us who come from Arctic states embrace the snow. So I think in parts of the world, snow and cold is seen as something that's foreboding or scary or disfavorable. I think know-how is actually embracing the snow, loving the snow. And certainly over the weather patterns we've seen in Tromsø over the last week, I've loved the return of the snow, proper cold to here, and being able to see that as something in which we thrive and that we very much embrace.
And it's also about Finland winning Canada in ice hockey.
Which is
I thought you might bring that up, Petteri.
Couldn't resist.
Couldn't resist.
And it is key. Gabby, know-how?
I think I'm a person who is in search of this redefinition. I don't think I could give you a definitive answer right now, and I think that's a good thing because I'd like to collect all of my experiences that I'm having right now as an early career and emerging leader and work toward this new definition while combining it with old narratives with the people around me. So I don't think I'm able to do that at this time because I'm still absorbing so much. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think redefining should take some time, and the old definitions definitely stuck around for a good long while. And it obviously, as we're seeing, takes a long time to break that.
The beauty about definitions, you can always redefine them. Doesn't matter how old or young you are. That was the fourth RecapTV and the almost last one. I have one more where we talk about artificial intelligence. I want to thank Petteri, Whitney, and Gabby for having joined me here, and I hope you also enjoyed our little conversation. Thank you very much for joining.